All right, scholars, here we are, chapter 7 today, page 73. Jingle bells. Mmm, delicious, said Annie. She and Jack slurped down the hot soup. As they chewed the salty soda crackers, they watched the dogs breathe peacefully in their sleep. Do most Alaskans have sled dogs? Asked Annie. Many do, said Ed, resting in his armchair near the fire. But the day is coming when dogs won't be used much anymore, except for racing. I can see it happening already. Small planes will get better and better and take over the long trips. Cars will improve, and roads too. Soon enough, we'll have vehicles that go through deep snow in no time. So, scholars, remember, this story takes place, right? It's set in the past. They traveled back in time. So, airplanes and cars are still pretty new at that time. That's good in a way, said Jack. It'll help medicine travel faster. But it's sad, too, said Annie. I'm with you, Missy, said Ed, looking at the sleeping dogs. Breaks the heart of an old timer like me. People have used sled dogs for hundreds of years in this territory. I myself have known many brave dogs during my lifetime. Do you know Balto? Said Jack. Gunner Kaysen's dog? We've heard of him. Sure do, said Ed. Balto is the best lead dog in Alaska, along with Togo, Leonard Sepula's dog. Both Togo and Balto have stopped here on runs with Sepula and Kaysen. What's Balto like? Asked Annie. Ah, that dog loves to run a trail, said Ed. Loves it more than any dog I ever saw. Great strength and lots of courage. Big, shaggy black dog. Beautiful to watch because of his spirit. Annie smiled. I'd like to meet him. Annie has a special way with dogs, Jack explained. With all animals, really, said Annie. Ed smiled at her. Alaskans are real respectful of animals, too, he said. We wouldn't have survived a minute without 'em. People here have learned to use all the gifts this frozen world can give. Like what? Asked Jack. Well, the socks I just gave you are made of sheep's wool, said Ed. The parkas that are drying over there are made of squirrel fur. We all wear sealskin pants and reindeer boots and fox fur hats. I wear moose skin and caribou skin and rabbit fur. The medicine headed for Nome is wrapped in bear hide. The medicine itself is made from horse serum. What's serum? Said Jack. The blood of a horse, said Ed. It has antitoxins to kill the diphtheria. Wow, said Annie. So, scholars, did you hear that? So, the medicine for diphtheria is made from the blood of a horse. Hmm. Wow, said Annie. So, Alaskans get gifts from. She held up one finger after another. Sheep, squirrels, seals, reindeer, foxes, moose, caribou, rabbits, bears, horses, and dogs, said Jack, finishing his milk. And dogs, of course, said Annie. And fish and whales and birds of the air. All creatures, said Ed. So everything's connected, said Annie. So, scholars, did you catch all those different animals that provide things for the people? That's right, said Ed, nodding. Eventually, it all becomes one thing: the people, the land, the animals, the sea, and the air. It becomes Alaska. Cool, said Jack. The three of them stared for a long moment at the dogs. Some of the huskies paddled the air with their paws, as if they were dreaming about running over the trail. Ed yawned, and his eyes started to close. A moment later, his head drooped forward, and he was snoring. Jack quietly put down his spoon. He tiptoed to the stove and grabbed his fur boots. They were dry, but his socks were still damp. So he pulled the boots over the big pair of socks Ed had given him. "It's time to head to Solomon," he whispered to Annie. "We have to finish what we came here to do." Annie nodded. Ed snored loudly as Jack and Annie silently pulled on their fur parkas. They grabbed their mittens and slipped over to the dogs and gently woke them. The dogs jumped to their feet. Even though there were whines and yips, Ed kept snoring. "Thanks, Ed," Jack whispered to the sleeping man. "Yeah, thanks for being so nice to us and the dogs," whispered Annie. Then, very quietly, she led the team out of the log cabin. Jack followed, closing the door behind them. Outside, the wind and snow were blowing wildly. Jack and Annie pulled off their mittens long enough to harness the team. They nimbly hooked the dogs to tug lines, neck lines, and the tow line. "Ready?" Jack shouted above the wind. "I hope Ed doesn't worry about us when he wakes up," Annie shouted back. And here they are, right, getting the team all hooked up on their tug lines and onto the gang line, getting all set to leave. "Oh man, I just thought of something," said Jack. "What?" "Stardust," said Jack. "For Ed." Ever remember what the stardust does? Makes people forget about them. "Yes," said Annie. Leaving the dogs waiting for a moment, she and Jack hurried back to the cabin, slipped inside, and closed the door. Ed was still snoring. Annie reached into her pocket and took out the dark blue box. When she opened the lid, the silvery dust shimmered like starlight. She emptied a small amount into her palm and tossed the glittering dust into the air, whispering, "We wish to be forgotten." The stardust flashed through the room, then quickly evaporated. To Jack's amazement, the bowls, spoons, and cups were clean and stacked neatly on the counter. Jack's damp socks had vanished. The unopened soup can was back on the shelf. The hay was neatly spread across the floor. "No sign we were here," said Annie. "Except Ed will be missing a pair of socks," whispered Jack. Annie laughed. "Full speed ahead," she whispered. Then she and Jack slipped back outside into the storm. They ran through the blowing snow to their waiting team. "I'm happy to drive for a while," Jack shouted in the wind. "Is that okay with you?" "Sure, I'll take over whenever you want," said Annie. She picked up the snow hook and put it into the basket, then climbed in herself. Jack stood on the sled runners, crouching slightly and gripping the handlebars. "Okay, team, ready to find Gunner and save lives?" he said. The huskies barked, as if saying, "Yes, yes, yes." "Ready, willing, and eager," said Annie. "Line out," Jack commanded. The team pulled the tow line straight out, making it taut. So remember, when something's taut, it's pulled tightly, right? If right, my headphones right now, this is not pulled taut, but when I go like this, right, now it's pulled taut, tightly pulled. So they pulled that gang line, right? The team pulled the tow line straight out, making it taut. Hike, said Jack. The 8 huskies surged forward. Bells jingling, the team raced away from the roadhouse of Port Safety, pulling the sled through the blizzard. As the basket bounced and bumped over the uneven ridges on the trail, Annie almost fell out. But she didn't complain. Jack could hear her laughing as if she were enjoying the ride. The wind from the frozen sea was bitterly cold. As the wind howled and snow whirled through the dark, the dogs kept their heads down and ran on and on. Jack used his skills to move the team around banks of drifting snow. Through gale-force winds, he drove the sled over the rough, frozen path at the edge of the sea. Like sand in a sandstorm, ice crystals beat against his face, stinging his skin. His mittens were nearly frozen to the wooden handles, but he felt protected in his thick fur clothing. He was grateful to all the creatures that had given their gifts to help Alaskans survive in their frozen world. As more and more snow stuck to the lenses of his glasses and turned to ice, Jack knew he shouldn't keep driving. "We need to switch now," he called to Annie. Before he could give a command to stop the dogs, a fierce gust of wind slammed against the sled, sending it into a bank. Jack fell off the runners and was swallowed up in a pile of snow. "Jack!" cried Annie. "Where are you?" "Here, here," said Jack, floundering as he tried to get up. His heavy fur clothing made it hard for him to stand, but Annie grabbed his hands and helped him to his feet. Together, they pulled the sled out from the snowbank and untangled the rigging. Remember, untangled, so not tangled. So they're making it not tangled. "I can drive for a while," said Annie. "Okay," said Jack. He sat in the basket. Annie stood on the runners. "Line out!" she shouted. The dogs straightened their lines. But before Annie commanded them to take off, she yelled, "Jack, listen!" Jack listened. He heard the shriek of the wind and the whooshing of snow. "Listen to what?" he said. "Bells! I hear bells!" Annie shouted. "Up ahead!" Now Jack could hear the bells too. Jingling bells. "Yes," he said. "Another dog team must be coming toward us." "Could it be Gunner, Kaysen, and Balto?" shouted Annie. "Maybe," yelled Jack. The jingling bells grew closer and closer. "Yay! They're coming this way for sure!" shouted Annie. But the sound of the bells stopped suddenly. Then, through the storm, came the frantic, high-pitched barking of dogs. Something has happened, and we won't know what until tomorrow. All right, scholars, back to our packet work.